Let me then introduce Emma Kluge. Emma is a historian of decolonisation, international organisations, and the Pacific. She has recently completed her PhD at the University of Sydney and has just finished up as a senior research fellow with Anglican Deaconess Ministries. She will soon be starting a postdoc at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. In fact, very soon, because that's where she is tonight. So if you see that she looks warmer than the rest of it, it's because she just told me earlier that it's 38 degrees over there. And she is also in quarantine. So she is doing her time there and will be released soon. But an exciting opportunity that she is just beginning over there in Florence. She has recently completed her PhD thesis, which was titled Decolonisation Interrupted, the West Papuan Campaign for Independence and the United Nations, 1961 to 69. And last year, she published an article with the International History Review titled West Papua and the International History of Decolonisation, 1961 to 69. Her topic tonight is about the Pacific. And as Australians, the Pacific is our closest neighbour, but few of us have much understanding of the region or of the deep connection between Australia and the Pacific. And so tonight, she will be sharing her journey to becoming a Pacific historian and why all of us should know at least a bit about Pacific history. She's going to be inviting us into a bit of the understanding of the lives and ideas of West Papuan activists, emphasizing the perspectives of people who have often been excluded from traditional narratives of international history. And she's going to be inviting us to reflect on the way history shapes how we see ourselves.
And also, just before I start, I have a little bit of I'm going to mention a few different things to read and look at, and I'm actually going to post a list of those things in the chat at the end. So don't worry about writing any of those titles down. You'll be able to access at the end. So anyway, yes, I'm Emma Kluge, and as Byron mentioned, I finished my PhD at the beginning of this year and have just completed a position as a senior research fellow at ADM. I kind of used that time to think about my work and my PhD in a little bit more broader terms. So part of what I was interested in doing was kind of thinking about what it would mean for Australians to kind of connect more with Pacific history. And at the same time, I am working on turning my thesis into a book. So I also use that fellowship to work on a book proposal, which I will be continuing to, for the book that I'll be writing here. And as Byron mentioned as well, I'm currently in Florence in Italy, where I'm doing a postdoctoral fellowship at the European University Institute. It probably seems strange to you, and it seems strange to me to move to Europe to study the Pacific. But as I was mentioning to people in the breakout rooms, it's a way for me to kind of get funding for the work I'm doing. So I'm not going to say no. And I get to do it surrounded by this beautiful place. So yeah, thank you for joining me. Thank you for giving me something to do in this period of isolation that I've had in Italy. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to gather with you here on Zoom and to talk about Pacific history. And it's great to see that all the places you're Zooming from around Australia. And I'd just like to thank Byron and the team at Paddington Anglican and Peace Talks for facilitating this talk and allowing me to share with you today. And thanks for Jess, who invited me to speak as well. I really love the idea of Peace Talks as a space for political, ethical, artistic and cultural engagement. It's something that I aim to do in my work. So it's wonderful to find a place that's supportive of that. And it's great to get to share with a new group of people as well as some friends and family. So I believe that history is our collective memory, and that in order to move towards a more just future, we need to understand the past of our region and those around us. So in my work, I'm committed to being attentive to a multiplicity of voices, to unsettle power and representational inequalities that are present in historical narratives of Australia and the Pacific. So today I'm going to talk about my work as a historian. As I mentioned, was mentioned in my bio, I recently completed my PhD in history. And my work focuses on the West Papuan independence movement. In this work, I trace the lives and ideas of West Papuan activists who sought independence and human rights at the United Nations during the 1960s. I seek out the perspectives of peoples who are often been excluded from traditional narratives of international history. And I also explore the connections between West Papuans and allies across the world in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. So during this session, I'm going to share my kind of unusual journey into studying this topic and my motivations for continuing to work in the field of Pacific history. And I want to invite you to think about how your understanding of history shapes the way you see yourself and your community. And then maybe at the end, provide some suggestions for how we might begin to understand ourselves as part of the Pacific and what it looks like to connect our ideas of history with the Pacific. So for those of you who are less familiar with Pacific history, I hope this talk might give you a starting point for exploring the topic. And for those of you who are well versed in this area, maybe it can just give you a space to think about your experiences and understandings of history and how they've shaped the way you see the world and your place in it. So I'm going to do my best to pitch this both for those of you who are familiar with the field and for those of you who might just be exploring this for the first time. So if anything's unclear or confusing, I'm more than happy to answer questions at the end, or you can pop them in the chat as we go along, and either myself or someone else should be able to answer your question. So firstly, I want to start with my work on West Papua and how I became a historian of the Pacific. I know some of you are quite familiar with the history of West Papua, but I always like to start with a quick overview just to make sure we're all on the same page. So when I say West Papua, I'm referring to the territory that occupies the western half of the island of New Guinea. You can see the map of New Guinea on the screen. And West Papua has been given many names over the years: Netherlands New Guinea, West New Guinea, West Irian, Irian Jaya. And Indonesia has now divided the territory into two units, Papua and West Papua. But I use West Papua to refer to this whole western half of the region because it's the name used by West Papuan nationalists both today and during the period I study. So during the 1950s, West Papua was under Dutch colonial control. And after the loss of its Indonesian empire, the Dutch turned their focus to the territory and began to facilitate a process of decolonisation to make West Papua an independent territory. West Papuan leaders took this opportunity to launch their own campaign for independence in the 1960s. This process was then interrupted by Indonesia, who claimed the territory belonged within its Indonesian Republic and leveraged Cold War politics to gain US support, forcing the Netherlands into negotiations, which resulted in the territory being transferred from Dutch to Indonesian control, all being done without the consultation of the West Papuan peoples. West Papua was then formally incorporated into the Indonesian Republic in 1962 after a so-called act of free choice. While this vote was meant to allow the West Papuan population to choose whether or not to remain part of Indonesia, the representatives were handpicked by the Indonesian government, and the process was tightly controlled so that only one outcome was allowed: the incorporation of West Papua into the Indonesian Republic. The sovereignty of the territory is still contested to this day, with many activists arguing that the West Papuan people should be given the right to an internationally supervised referendum, where, unlike in the act of free choice, the people are actually given the opportunity to vote on the future of the territory. So while I'm explaining the 1960s in this simplified way, the situation is very complex, and it took me almost 2 years of PhD study to even be able to write a paragraph like that. And obviously this summary also doesn't include all the things that happened between these agreements and these votes, the campaign of the West Papuans, which is what my work focuses on. But hopefully that's enough for you to at least have a little bit of a touch point as we continue on. Okay, so my journey. Before I started my PhD, I knew almost nothing about West Papua. I couldn't even point the territory out to you on a map. Like many people, I'd assumed that the island of New Guinea was occupied only by Papua New Guinea. I had no idea that the western half was a completely separate territory with a distinct colonial history. So how did I get here to focusing on West Papua? Well, when I started my undergraduate degree, I was studying secondary teaching with a double major in English and history. Yet this all changed the moment I sat in my first history lecturer. I remember looking up at the lecturer, who was a woman, and thinking, I want to do that job. I want to get to teach history and really dig into the detail of these different historical periods. So halfway through my degree, I swapped into a straight arts degree and pursued my focus on history. When I got to my third and final year of my degree, I realized that I hadn't done a single Australian history course. I figured it would be pretty embarrassing to come out with a history degree and know nothing about the region that I lived in. So I enrolled in a couple of history units to take in my last final semesters. In these courses, I learned so many new things and got a really deep appreciation for the history of these lands. I also was increasingly convicted of the need to learn more about history and to teach others about these histories that I was learning. I saw the way our lack of understanding about history played into society. Part of my motivation to understand Australia and the Pacific was due to the timing of my study. So I finished my undergraduate degree as the government was implementing the Pacific solution, confining refugees in offshore detention centres on Manus Island. As many of you might recall, the common catchphrase during this time was that refugees should go back to where they came from. This kind of discourse was particularly confusing to me, as it was often spouted by people who were not Indigenous to Australia, who were migrants at some point themselves. What gave them the right to decide who could and couldn't come to Australia? Why was their migration somehow more legitimate than those of newly arrived refugees? I soon started preparing to do an honours year so that I could keep studying. And when I started discussions with my honours supervisor about what I should write a thesis on, she encouraged me to find a topic that sparked anger in me, something that lit a fire under my belly. So I began reading more about Australia's history of race and migration. And during this time, I came across the story of West Papuan refugees in the Australian administered territory of Papua New Guinea. So these refugees were actually the first to be detained on Manus Island. And in the book I was reading, the historian mentioned that few people had studied the stories of West Papuan refugees and used the case refugees in Papua New Guinea and used the case files that the Australian government actually held, and that this would be a really interesting topic for someone to look into more deeply. And I remember reading this and thinking, perhaps naively, oh, it's me, I should do this project. So as all good historians do, I went to the archives to try and learn more about this period and construct a narrative of what had occurred during this period of history. At this point, I still knew very little about West Papua and almost nothing about the independence campaign. So I was introduced to the campaign here in the reading room of the National Archives of Australia in Canberra during my honours year in 2015. Here I encountered a collection of case files which included personal statements of West Papuan refugees who were seeking refuge in Papua New Guinea. And as I followed the stories of these West Papuan refugees in the archives, I was introduced to the West Papuan campaign for independence, into this world that they were painting of kind of their experiences under Indonesian colonialism. So in their applications for permissive residence in Papua New Guinea, West Papuan refugees were given the opportunity to make a personal statement that would be included in their application. And I don't know how many of you have worked with government files or made government files, but largely they're quite dry and very administrative. But these sections were just incredible because it was the one time you actually got to read the voices of the West Papuans and read their stories directly. One of the first personal statements I read was from Daniel Kadam, who sought refuge in Papua New Guinea in 1969. And I'm going to read an excerpt of it here today. So he wrote, "I decided to withdraw with my family to the territory of Papua New Guinea. Reasons: all political figures and organisations have had consultations to ask the Indonesian government to guarantee freedom of political action, party activity, and assembly. But after this was leaked, there were wild arrests, killings, and shootings put into action by the Indonesian armed forces, suffering in and out of prison, and property looted and stolen by the Indonesian army, for me personally and for comrades in arms. 30,000 West Papuans, ordinary people, have been casualties. 1963 until 1969 has become a matter for us all." Kadam's statement and his fire recorded his experiences in West Papua. He was imprisoned by the Indonesian army and sought refuge in Papua New Guinea because he feared Indonesian retaliation as a result of his involvement with the West Papuan independence movement, the OPM. Reading the personal statements of West Papuans like Kadam, I was brought into their struggle for independence. As the West Papuans described their suffering under Indonesian colonialism and their desires for the future of West Papua, I became invested in this story and in their struggle. Their words radicalised me and changed the direction of my study and, in a way, my life. So after my honours year, I wanted to know more about West Papua and their campaign. So I decided to continue on and do a PhD so I could dig deeper into the history of the West Papuan independence campaign. I was particularly interested in their campaign to the United Nations, since this was an ongoing strategy of West Papuan activists. Yet I was frustrated with how many academics of history of West Papua in the 1960s tended to sideline West Papuan voices. West Papuan actors were there in the narrative, but they were often the objects of debate rather than the subjects. So often West Papuans were referenced only in relation to the Netherlands or Indonesia, or the resistance movement was used as background detail to the challenges faced by the UN mission in negotiating the conflict. I knew West Papuans campaigned to the United Nations during this time, so I went searching for more direct access to their campaign at the UN archives in New York, pictured on screen. Disappointingly, very understated compared to the other UN buildings. And here I found files literally labelled petitions, which contains hundreds of letters written by West Papuans during the 1960s. These files are in the footnotes of other accounts, but only ever mentioned in passing. Few historians ever quoted from them or took the time to dig into their meaning. In these petitions, a whole world of West Papuan ideas and political thinking opened up to me. Ideas that both fleshed out and challenged the dominant historical narratives about West Papua in the 1960s. Yet using the UN archives also came with its own challenges and raised many questions for me. What did it mean to study the West Papuan campaign for independence using the archives of the UN? How would this influence the story that was told and the perspectives that were represented? The United Nations archives are almost overwhelming in their detail about West Papua in the 1960s. The issue of the future of the West Papua was debated at the UN General Assembly, and then the agreement transferring it from Dutch to Indonesian control, called the New York Agreement, was negotiated by the United Nations. And under this agreement, the United Nations was required to both administer the territory for a short amount of time and also return and observe the act of free choice. So there were pages and pages of administrative reports from the UN representatives who went to West Papua over the years. But like with the other government archives, West Papuan voices were almost totally absent from them. However, the UN archives provided a compelling counter-narrative to the one I'd set out to write, drawing me into the logic of the UN and along a path already well-trodden by other scholars, assessing the significance of the UN and the validity of the New York Agreement and the act of free choice in determining the future of West Papua. So if you were to go through all the previous versions of my thesis, you would see many copies where I got sidetracked by these archives, long passages on the debates between Indonesia and the Netherlands, pages dissecting the effectiveness of the UN's administration, and lots of other things. Yet this isn't the history I was trying to follow and not how I want to contextualize the petitions of the West Papuans. While I really valued the scholars who did want to argue about these international agreements, I felt that focusing on those agreements actually kind of undermined West Papuan claims to sovereignty and often ended up silencing the voices and perspectives of West Papuans who existed long before these international agreements had been signed. So to resist this logic, I drew deeper into the experiences of West Papuan individuals and communities. So in order to study the West Papuan campaign from independence to United Nations from a West Papuan perspective, I needed to reconstitute a West Papuan archive. And I collected this archive by following the lives of West Papuans to Papua New Guinea, the Netherlands, and the UN in New York. For those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with West Papua, it's actually kind of illegal to research West Papuan independence in the territory of West Papua. And pretty much most of the people or documents that might have existed during that time have been destroyed or the people have been forced to leave. So it's not actually a project that I could do from West Papua itself, and instead was a project, if I wanted to look at archives, a project that I kind of had to do from everywhere except West Papua. So here I returned to the case files of West Papuan refugees in Papua New Guinea. I conducted oral history interviews with the descendants of West Papuan activists in Papua New Guinea and the Netherlands, and sought out sources written by West Papuan activists and collected quotes of West Papuans from other accounts. This journey took me all around the world and was only facilitated by the privileged access to resources that I enjoyed as an Australian scholar at a well-funded university. Getting to know the different communities of West Papuan activists was particularly important to me to help me understand the significance of this period and how to frame the West Papuan campaign in the 1960s. I was lucky to get to conduct interviews with some of the descendants of West Papuan activists who wrote petitions to the UN in the 1960s. Through these interviews, I got a sense of the lives of West Papuan activists, their motivation, and also their ongoing legacies. It also started to change the way I saw the world and engage with the people around me. During this journey, I became part of the story I was telling. While I narrated the history of West Papuan independence movement in the 1960s, I was brought into the ongoing struggle for West Papuan independence, a movement that still continues to this day as the people seek the chance to participate in the truly free vote of self-determination and seek to live freely in their lands. By reading these letters from the 1960s, I was convinced of these arguments and was inspired to share those perspectives with other people and continue to promote the struggle of West Papuan people. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the historical narrative that I constructed from doing this work or to share all the different ideas of the West Papuans aside from their desires for independence and self-determination. But if you're interested in learning more about this, I'm more than happy to share some of my articles or my dissertation with you. And I also have a recent recorded version of a talk I gave outlining the West Papuan campaign during the 1960s that I'm more than happy to share. But I wanted to share this journey to explain to you how I came to study West Papua, yet also to highlight the challenges associated with accessing Pacific-focused historical research, challenges that you might not face if you're attempting to learn more about the US or the UK, in that it's often told from this kind of outsider perspective. How even for me as a historian with 4+ years to write a thesis, I had to fight to find the voices I was looking for. Yet I can tell you that this journey was deeply satisfying, and the work that resulted from it has been meaningful both to myself and to the West Papuan communities that I work with. Luckily, accessing most other parts of Pacific history are a little more straightforward. West Papua is particularly challenging due to Indonesia's aggressive oppression of the West Papuan people and their history. Yet it can still involve overturning some assumptions we might have and going against traditional historical narratives or moving past blind spots we might have when we go to learn about history. So now I want to zoom out and talk about Pacific history more generally, something that I don't usually get to do a lot and something that usually kind of scares me because I've gotten very used to speaking only about my very specific area of expertise, or when I teach, having a few months to prepare and kind of do a lot of research. But during my ADM fellowship, I've been trying to kind of gain confidence in speaking more broadly about this and think to kind of take the opportunities with different communities of people to think about the idea of what it means to think of ourselves as grounded in this region, grounded in the Pacific. So I want to provide you with some entry points for learning more about the Pacific and the connection with these lands we now call Australia. I noticed that we've got quite a different age group, so I apologize if any of my statements about what we learned in school might not apply to you, but hopefully you can kind of go with me and there'll be something new or interesting for you to think about. So my experiences in history class at school was learning a lot about world wars and events overseas, and very little about the history of this country, definitely very little about the history of our Indigenous peoples, and almost nothing about the Pacific, aside from as the battleground for the Second World War. And I think we were impoverished by this approach, and that much of the kind of division or our kind of selfishness when it comes to foreign policy is often because of this anemic understanding of the history of these lands and our regions. So I want to paint a really brief sketch of some of the ways in which our histories are connected to the Pacific, and also to provide different ways of viewing political or cultural moments that you might be used to seeing from a European or a US perspective. And I'm going to talk about the Pacific, but a lot of this also overlaps with Indigenous Australian histories. So I'm also going to be kind of touching with some of the moments that kind of overlap together. So the first moment I want to talk about is this kind of moment of explorers or the discovery of Australia and the Pacific. Many of us learn about explorers, I think usually in primary school. And while I'm sure some of you are now aware that these narratives are not so straightforward, that these discoveries were often more like invasions, I wonder how many of you have had the chance to go back and revisit this history, to look into the different perspectives of British exploration from the perspective of Indigenous peoples in Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific. So if you're interested in doing this, I recommend, I've got a few books that I recommend here. And the first one is by Alice Tupunga Somerville, and it's an essay she wrote called 250 Ways to Start an Essay About Captain Cook. And it's a response to the 250-year commemoration of Captain Cook's voyages. The essay, which is part prose, part poem, is a reflection on what it means to tell stories of contact, to try and narrate beginnings and how she grapples with the legacies of colonialism as a Māori person and a scholar. The next one is Kate Fulliger's The Warrior, the Voyager and the Artist. And this is a 18th century story that follows the stories of Joshua Reynolds, a British artist, and two Indigenous men, Cherokee Ostenako and the Raiateran May. And it draws attention to the ways in which Indigenous people's contributions to these voyages and the ways in which Indigenous knowledge and science contributed to the European exploration. The third book is The Meeting Place by Vincent O'Malley, which is kind of tells the story from a New Zealand perspective. I think something that we Australians aren't very used to doing is thinking about things from this perspective. So I'd really recommend it for kind of an alternative perspective on this period. And the third one is Living with the Locals by John Maynard and Victoria Haskins, which tells the story of 13 Europeans who ended up being taken in and living with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in the early years of British settlement, many of whom ended up assimilating into Indigenous communities. These stories provide an alternative picture of contact between Europeans, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and move past the thin narratives we're usually told about this period. The next historical moment is slavery. And I think for many of us, we're used to thinking about slavery as something that happened overseas, something that kind of, we think of the transatlantic slavery, we think about the US, we think about the abolition movement in the UK, but the practice of slavery, which once it was abolished kind of became this new system of indentured labour, was actually practiced in Australia in what is now called Queensland. Pacific peoples were voluntarily and involuntarily recruited into indentured labour in the sugar plantations in northeastern Australia. Many faced grueling work conditions in Australia before eventually being forced to return home, often with broken bodies and little to show for their hard labour. A particularly good account of this historical moment is Tracy Banavanua Ma's Violence and Colonial Dialogue, and she tells the story of the South Sea Islanders who worked on these plantations while narrating the broader history of colonialism and violence in the 19th century. Now, I was going to say this might be new, but again, noticing my crowd's a bit more diverse age-wise, this probably isn't as surprising to you guys, but that Australia has a colonial history. And that while, you know, a lot of us are kind of grappling with what it means to live in a settler colony of Australia and the ongoing legacies of colonialism here, that Australia also has a colonial legacy in the Pacific, that we were a colonial power in places like Papua New Guinea and Nauru, who still to this day suffer from the injustices of Australian colonial rule. I think many of us think of colonies that were formed in the 15th to 19th centuries, but in the case of Australia, we became a colonial power in the 20th century by taking over former German and British colonies over the course of the World Wars. I don't have specific reading recommendations for this one, but I think it's worth remembering when you read news stories about Australia's engagement with the Pacific. For me, it shed new light on why PNG might say yes to housing Australian refugees in Manus Island. It made me think about this as part of a longer history of colonial inequalities. Following on from this, Australian colonialism and mining, so I am, and I don't know about you, very used to thinking about mining in Australia in relation to Australia, but Australia also has a history of exploiting colonial territories in the Pacific through aggressive mining. And in particular, this is phosphate mining. Our agricultural boom in the 1950s actually came as a direct result of mining the heart out of Pacific islands. For example, the island of Banaba, which had formed over thousands of years, was destroyed during an 80-year period of mining done by Australian, British, and New Zealand contractors. Miners removed 90% of the surface of the island, which you can see the destruction on the photo on the screen, stripping away the phosphate to enrich Australian and New Zealand farms. And in the wake of the mining, they left Banaba uninhabitable. The peoples of this island who had seen their land and ancestors' burial sites destroyed were then forced to locate to Fiji in order to survive. Similar mining also occurred in Nauru, stripping the island of its resources. And again, this legacy explains much of the instability experienced by Nauruans in recent years, and also its reliance on foreign aid. So my recommendations for this one is Katerina Teoa's Consuming Ocean Island, Stories of People and Phosphate from Banaba. And it's a historical account of phosphate mining in Banaba, Tewa is a Bannerman woman and a Pacific historian, and she's painstakingly reconstructed the history of this time, but also kind of weaving it together with poetry and stories. And then if you're interested in Nauru and its history of colonial domination and extractive mining, I recommend Kate Storr's recent book, International Status in the Shadow of Empire. My second to last moment is actually the civil rights movement. I think we're used to thinking about and studying the civil rights movement from the perspective of the United States or maybe South Africa. However, there was an active civil rights movement here. For those of you who have engaged with Brooke Prentice and the work of Common Grace, you're probably already aware of some of these key protests and some of the different groups that existed. So in the US, there was the NAACP, but in Australia, there was, and excuse the language here, this is the historic language, the Aborigines Advancement League, which was then later called the Aboriginal Advancement League. And this was one of the many organisations that fought for the rights of Indigenous peoples in Australia. It was this struggle for rights which resulted in the recognition of Indigenous peoples in the Australian Constitution in 1967. So while these kind of linked to the US struggles, the demands in Australia and New Zealand differed from those in the US because alongside seeking equality under law, they also sought recognition of their land rights and an equal voice in Parliament. Something that might sound familiar for those of you who are engaged in the struggle we're still having today. In the 1960s, there was a series of protests and worker strikes which aimed at addressing issues of unequal pay, but also took on the government's approach to land rights. And in the 1960s, Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists also actually staged their own freedom rides through northwestern Australia, northwestern New South Wales, protesting discrimination and racism in regional New South Wales. In the 1970s, this led to the establishment of the Tent Embassy in Canberra, which was a protest against the McMahon's government's approach to land rights. He'd proposed granting 50-year leases to Indigenous communities on a conditional basis of meeting certain economic and social markers. So for a history of this movement, I recommend Richard Broom's Fighting Hard, which traces the history of the Aboriginal Advancement League in Victoria. I also recommend Anne Curthoy's Freedom Rides. Curthoy is an Australian historian who actually participated in the Freedom Rides when she was a student at Sydney University and later wrote a memoir about her experiences and kind of the vitriol and hatred they faced being on these buses in New South Wales. And it's a very compelling account and probably an account that we're not necessarily used to reading in relation to Australia. And another recommendation is a book called The 1967 Referendum. This is the second edition by Bain Atwood and Andrew Marcus, which kind of traces the activism in the lead up to the referendum. And the final moment is this kind of moment of international activism in the 1970s that was kind of facilitated by increased ability to access air travel, increased connectivity through news and media. And so some of you might recall the 70s as a period of kind of feminist marches and anti-Vietnam protests, etc. But this period was also a high point for international activism across the Pacific and connecting with Australia and New Zealand as well. So due to the increased mobility that was facilitated by plane travel, activists were able to communicate and interact with each other with increasing regularity. And this led to connections across Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific, as well as connections forged with Black activists from Africa, North America, and the Caribbean. The landmark book on this topic is Tracy Banner-Vanua-Ma's Decolonisation of the Pacific. And here she weaves together stories of Pacific peoples across Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific as they fought for rights and independence from the 19th to 20th century. It covers decolonizational struggles in places like West Papua and Fiji. It covers the Black Power movement in the Pacific and also goes through environmental protests against nuclear testing and climate change. So if I have to recommend only one book for you to read today, it would probably be this book. It's a masterpiece and has kind of inspired a lot of the work that I do. So these are just a few ways we can think about these global moments from the perspective of the Pacific. Unfortunately, a lot of what I'm pointing to are moments that are really uncomfortable for us to grapple with. Yet I think that by digging into these moments, we can also be inspired by the resilience of Indigenous peoples in Australia and the Pacific. And just reading about the campaigns and different ideas, I've been inspired by the vision of Pacific peoples for what the future could hold, even despite all of these challenges. So I don't have a clear take-home point here. I'm not sure what will happen to you if you decide to learn more about Pacific history, or maybe for those of you who will be continue this journey, or just share it with friends. But my hope is that by exploring new perspectives, it will make you a more ingenuous and engaged person, that it can continue to open our eyes to the ways God is working all around us, and that it will help us feel more grounded in this region and connected to its peoples. So as I said in the opening, I believe that history is our collective memory, and that just as our personal memories and stories shape our identity and our behaviour, our collective histories have the same power to transform us, our churches and our societies. So thank you so much for listening. I'd like to open the floor now for questions and for discussions, and I've included my email and my Twitter on the screen. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you have questions later, or would like any extra information on what I've spoken about.
All right. So there are a couple of questions there. I've put quite a complex one that, I don't expect you to be able to give, it raises many other topics, but I think there's a very, very interesting field. And so I just would be curious about any kind of links that you would be willing to draw on another set of events that I personally learned nothing about in my own schooling and university until more recent years.
Well, yes, I'm happy to look answer your question first. So I guess it kind of relates to the Cold War and Indonesia and the US. And so you're asking about the kind of the massacres that happened in 1965. So for those of you who don't know that historical period, Indonesia gained its independence in around 1949, and had for a long time one president called President Sukarno, who basically became a dictator in Indonesia after wanting to create a democratic republic, ended up kind of becoming its sole leader. And he initially was kind of sponsored by the US government, but as he became more kind of communist and started to become more sympathetic to the communist government, the US kind of started to get a bit nervous. And so when it comes to West Papua, the West Papuan campaign was a big part of Indonesia's kind of international campaign. And so they were very much like West Papua as part of our country. And so in the negotiations between the Netherlands and Indonesia, the US really wanted to see West Papua become part of Indonesia, because they wanted to try and pacify Indonesia and to try and kind of shore Indonesia up as an ally in that region and as an anti-communist power. And so the kind of those politics were partly what fed into that transfer of authority from the Netherlands to Indonesia. However, once Indonesia had control over West Papua, that didn't necessarily, they kind of continued on with their same policy. They became more and more kind of communist. And then eventually there was this very mysterious coup that's still kind of not explained yet, where the General Suharto, which unfortunately has very similar name to President Sukarno, ended up taking control of government, and the US kind of intelligence service, the CIA, actually provided the Indonesian government with lists of all of the communist people in Indonesia, which led to a massacre of almost 1 million people, which was kind of claimed to be this way of kind of purging all the communist people within Indonesia. And kind of they somehow blamed the communists on overthrowing Sukarno, and said that justified them kind of killing millions of people, thousands of people. So yeah, so they're all kind of connected, but then because Suharto had kind of rose up and he once again shored them up as this anti-communist power, they kind of almost got to do over and relaunch their foreign policy. And so once he came into power, it was very much like, oh, when you Indonesia, we're democratic Indonesia. West Papua looks really bad, but that's because of Sukarno, that's because of this old regime. We are now going to invest in West Papua, and we are going to make it an equal part of Indonesia. And so that was kind of used as a way of justifying the fact that West Papua now had dramatic, like rights within West Papua had dramatically deteriorated even over a period of 4 years, and the living standards had dropped. But they kind of used the regime change to justify why that might be so. And the foreign minister of Indonesia during that time was actually so good at kind of getting Indonesia back into the UN that he became head of the General Assembly in 1971. So these politics did play a really big role in kind of West Papua, it became this kind of political football rather than it actually being about the rights of West Papuan peoples. But at the same time, during that period, the West Papuans were doing more and more activism at the General Assembly. And so while Indonesia had initially had the support of African and Asian independent nations, that especially the African leaders were increasingly kind of disturbed by the ways in which West Papuan rights and the idea of them actually getting a fair vote in 1969 was kind of being swept aside, and they were kind of being discarded for this kind of political purpose. And so you kind of see a shift in the way that those African countries are talking about West Papua, and a lot of people were actually saying, wait a second, this feels like the Indonesian regime feels a lot like the colonialism that we've been suffering under. So sorry, that was a kind of complicated response, but it's kind of very complicated period. So yeah, I might go back. I think we had David's question. Was that the first one? I'm not sure I'm missing him. Which was what surprised me most in my studies and explained some aspect of Australian society today. I think the first thing that struck me was because I was studying migration and race. And I think for me, I'd really only learned about the history of British migrants. My family are German Lutheran, so I knew a little bit about the German Lutheran community, but actually not very much. And so firstly, it helped me discover my own history. Like I started talking to my grandparents about when did we come here and why did we come here and how do we kind of fit within Australian society? And so I started to learn more about the German Lutheran community and why they'd come here, and actually got the opportunity to research German experiences during the wars. But it also explained to me the migration patterns of different peoples. And so learning that, Chinese migration was actually really early, that in the 19th century. And I think there's often this assumption that Chinese migrants are really recent, and why there are recent patterns of migration, actually Chinese migration is really long and old. And if you have to look between a Greek community and a Chinese community, potentially the Chinese community has been in Australia for a lot longer. And so I think it was just understanding, kind of fitting the pieces together of those different waves of migration and kind of getting an appreciation for all the kind of different groups that we had in Australia and when they'd come here and how they kind of contributed to certain moments, but then also how the Australian government over time had kind of shifted ideas of race, and kind of firstly starting out with this idea of whiteness that was very British, and then as they needed more and more migration, it kind of then included Western Europeans, and then it included Eastern Europeans, and but that for often those migrants initially they did face a lot of racism, and that kind of the way we're used to thinking about race in Australian society has kind of been constructed over time. So I don't know if that's a kind of complicated response, but I think that was the thing. So Bernard has asked, what would be the ideal future for West Papua? And then I'm just trying to see if any of these overlap. Okay, no, they're all kind of different. I really struggle with this question, partly because my work is so much about privileging West Papuan perspectives, and so it often means that I'm a little bit reluctant to provide my own solutions for the future of West Papua, because as someone who studied history, that's what I've seen many foreign governments do time and time again. And so that feels a bit like a cop-out, but for me, partly it is to listen to the voices of West Papuan peoples. So there's some variation within the West Papuan communities. Obviously, there's West Papuans living in West Papua, who, are the ones living under the Indonesian regime, but who also some have quite complex interactions with the Indonesian governments. For some, it's to be kind of people who are suffering and oppressed, but for others, they've kind of been blended with some of the Indonesian communities. And so, Indonesian people have become neighbours and friends and that kind of thing. And so I think for people in West Papua, the answer to that is often quite complicated. What does it mean now that, 50+% of the population comes from Indonesia? What would independence look like? And so there's definitely a lot of different thinkers talking about different ways in which they see that looking. But then there's also the West Papuan diaspora, so those in the Netherlands and in Papua New Guinea and in Australia. And I think the perspective of those overseas is they're often a lot more free to express what they want and the future they want. And so I think for at least the communities I've met, obviously I've pursued the activists, so that gives me a particular vision. I think for them, they really do want to see another referendum. And which, sorry, I should acknowledge the people in West Papua, there's also a lot of support for that. But so kind of an opportunity for the West Papuan people to actually decide, can we have independence or will we remain part of Indonesia? But obviously a lot of activists acknowledge that again, that question is quite complicated now, that 50% of the population that live in the territory aren't West Papuan. And there have been another number of different ways in which the Indonesian government, I'm not as much of an expert on this. There's probably a few other people in Zoom who could narrate this a bit better than I could. But the Indonesian government have at different points tried to kind of give some agreements to give more autonomy to West Papua. But what's happened recently is that in doing these autonomy agreements, they've actually taken away rights of the West Papuans and ended up dividing the territory and bringing in more military. So it doesn't necessarily seem, the attempts between the Indonesian state and the West Papuan people haven't necessarily been very successful. So yeah, so that's my sketch of the different options out there. I would love to see at least UN kind of investigations into the human rights situations in West Papua. I think that's probably the most pressing thing, is that West Papuan peoples are not free, that they're not able to express their desires for independence, that they don't have equal access to jobs, to rights to resources. West Papua is one of the most resource-rich territories in the whole world, yet Indigenous West Papuans are some of the poorest. So I think any solution and any future for the West Papuans needs to involve kind of addressing these justice issues alongside listening to West Papuan voices and giving them more opportunities to express what they want for the future. So I hope that answered your question, Bernard. So Philip and Rosemary, we wonder what the main benefits are to Indonesia in suppressing the population of West Papua. Yes, it's a good question, and probably one that, so for Indonesia, West Papua as a region has a lot of resources. So part of the desire to possess West Papua is to possess, the gold mines and the copper mines. Another part of it is land. So Indonesia is one of, I think it's, I haven't got my stats with me, but it's one of the largest, most densely populated places in the world. And so one of the challenges Indonesia constantly faces is access to land and resources. And so possessing West Papua and displacing West Papuans off of their own land is a way of kind of helping to compensate, especially in Java, for overpopulation and those kinds of things. So in displacing West Papuans from their land, in taking over and taking those resources, Indonesia benefits from those access to resource and access to land, very similar to the way that British Australians in Australia have displaced Indigenous peoples from their land, because they saw it as a way of, gaining access to resources and to land. So that's kind of the main reason for taking over West Papua. Partly as well, it was because Indonesia is a very divided place. Kind of this war for West Papua was almost used to kind of unify the country and give them something to fight behind, and also kind of as a distraction against the internal divisions. And so that kind of same nationalism and expansionism was actually also what drew them to invade East Timor, because it was this idea of like having this kind of thing to unite the military over and an excuse to kind of militarize these different regions. So partly, it was a way of getting more resources and a way of kind of gaining space and land for Indonesians in Java. Okay, Peter Penn asks, what is the current Australian government position on West Papuan independence? So the Australian government has for a long time kind of basically approached a policy of appeasement with Indonesia. Some might even say of aiding Indonesia. The Australian Defence Force currently actually train Indonesian military. And while they kind of say that that's for the purposes of just general national defence, a lot of those troops end up in West Papua. So while the Australian government would say that it doesn't support Indonesian human rights abuses in West Papua and it doesn't necessarily support those things, our kind of approach to maintaining Indonesia as an ally has often meant that we've aided Indonesia in colonising West Papua and in suppressing the rights of West Papuans. And so I think I heard one of the ministers, say that they supported human rights in West Papua, but we've not yet kind of signed on to any of the Pacific leaders' petitions at the UN to kind of see an inquiry. And so we haven't, the kind of Australian government's policy is kind of just to look away, because we see, like we did in the 1960s and to present, we see Indonesia as a necessary ally and a way of kind of like shoring up our northern flank, unfortunately. How much time do we have? Should I keep doing more questions? When are we?
I mean, I am finding these really fascinating answers and valuable answers.
Yeah.
I think perhaps I think there are maybe if we just have two more. There's a second one there from Peter, but maybe if we jump to the ones from Jessica and Matt, and then we might finish up there.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so yes, Jess says, what's your relationship with West Papua physically and current West Papuan residents? Yeah, so I'm do you mean as in physically, as in,
have you ever been to West Papua? And because it sounds like because of the diaspora and needing to study elsewhere, I just thought that was really fascinating. Have you ever been?
Yeah.
What are current people?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, with not being able to research in West Papua, I've actually never been to West Papua, which kind of feels crazy, because when I started studying West Papua, I thought I was just going to study West Papuan refugees in Papua New Guinea, and so I actually got a bit of a research profile. And then when I started studying the independence movement, I realized that most people who study West Papua and do field work in West Papua kind of have to do it covertly. And so they'll often do that before they have a research profile. So they'll go and work there with an NGO or go and do teaching. But unfortunately for me, by the time I realized that's what I wanted to focus on, I already had a research profile. And so it would have been quite dangerous for me to go to West Papua, and also for those that I wanted to speak to. And then in recent years, they've actually now meant that you can get deported for just talking about West Papua. And there was actually a journalist who was deported from her honeymoon in Bali because she'd written about West Papua in the newspaper. So that was very strange to me, and I kind of constantly feel uncomfortable about it. But at the same time, I am a historian and not an anthropologist. So often historians, we go to places because there are archives and there are people and those kinds of things. And while experiencing the place is really great, I don't have a time machine, so I can never actually go to West Papua in the 1960s. And so for me, it means that my work has been connecting with the West Papuans that are outside of West Papua, and particularly the West Papuans in Papua New Guinea was probably the closest I got, because, you know, the climate is similar and they've got their own kind of communities, and they've also included communities of people from the 60s, but also ongoing. So even up to very recent West Papua migrants. So they're quite connected to what's happening in West Papua. And then I'm also very connected to the diaspora in the Netherlands, and a lot of the key figures that wrote to the UN. I actually got to spend time with their descendants and kind of see the original West Papuan flag from 1961, like touch it, from 1960. And kind of see some of their letters and photos and stuff like that. So it's kind of this very weird relationship through kind of everywhere but West Papua. And then my ongoing relationship is often through activist networks. So I'm quite go to a lot of kind of the different seminars and protests and things like that to stay connected to that community. So was the other one Matt's question? Yeah. So what do you think we can do, particularly Australian churches, to be better neighbours in the Pacific generally? Well, so my very historian question, which I've kind of said today, is that I think partly just better understanding about the Pacific. I often, one of the things that I was talking to civic leaders and people who work for NGOs, especially when they interact with the government, is that this kind of sense of just ignorance about the Pacific, and often they're just shocked by the opinions and the perspectives that they hear from government officials or from people kind of working in those regions that are often kind of either come from not knowing anything about the Pacific or only having a lot of stereotypes about Pacific peoples. And so for me, I think being better neighbours starts with actually understanding that history that I've mentioned, like understanding the historical inequalities, but then also hopefully understanding the culture as it is now and people as they are now, because I think, you know, a lot of the kind of damage we've done has been thinking that we could just kind of come in with our own ideas about what Pacific countries should look like and force that on those peoples. And so I think part of being a good neighbour is coming with kind of understanding and an appreciation for the history of those places, but also just, I think, constantly being better at listening to our Pacific neighbours. Like, we've got access now to the internet, we can hear what Pacific leaders are saying. And so I think it would be spending probably a lot more time listening before we spend time talking and doing. So I think that's probably the key thing I've learned. So yeah, but hopefully I've answered those questions, and hopefully this has been a useful starting point for this topic. So thank you so much. It's been lovely to have such an engaged audience.
Well, and thank you, Emma. I think I speak on behalf of all of us in really appreciating your insight and wisdom and all the work that has gone into researching and preparing and articulating and sharing those insights with us this evening, sharing both some of your own story as well as the story of some near neighbours whose history is still, as you were saying, very much underappreciated by many of us and many in Australia, and the light that it might shed on our own sense of self and our own sense of history and the history of colonialism in this part of the world. So thank you for giving us a chance to do some of that listening, and for encouraging us to keep on listening to the voices at the margins, or the voices that whose perspectives can get silenced as inconvenient to those in power. And thank you to all you who have come and joined us. Thank you for your questions. Apologies for those we might not have got to, but thank you for coming and listening. As I said earlier, Peace Talks is a regular event hosted by Paddington Anglican, and we're aiming to serve the wider community by promoting and cultivating deep conversations about important topics. We have on the Paddington Church website, that's paddington.church, recordings of many of our previous events, and many of them are also available through iTunes or Apple Podcasts if you search for Peace Talks. Thank you for coming along this evening, and I will say farewell and good night.